So without much ado, now that the panel is out, let me welcome the Chief of Staff to the President for the closing remarks as I welcome here Professor Ibrahim Gambari.
The Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Hajia Dr. Zainab Ahmed, the Honorable Minister of State for Budget and Planning, Prince Clem Agba, the Chairman, Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Mr. Ighodalo. I see that we have a couple of things in common, including the fact that we can both say Floria Collegium. Many, many years in between, so it shows the young shall grow. Mr. Pascal Dossier, the pioneer chairman of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Mr. Osage Okumbo, the MD Shell, and I understand also vice chair of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Dr. Sarah Alade, the former deputy governor of the Central Bank and special advisor to Mr. President on Economic Affairs, Hajia Abiban M. Lawal, senior special assistant to the president for policy coordination, Hajia Saratu Umar, executive secretary, Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission, distinguished participants in this summit, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted that I'm able to sit and participate in the last plenary session, which is implementing the Nigerian project, which I believe is emblematic of the very rich and practical discussion that has characterized the day and a half of this year's edition of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Actually, I wish I was a participant on this side because I've had a number of things I would have liked to say, but my role has been limited essentially to delivering the closing address. But I have a couple of things to say nonetheless. But I'm also glad that, that I'm speaking last because nobody will have the right to exercise the right of reply since this, nothing I say here will be able to be challenged, certainly not at this session. But I just feel that one takeaway that I have from the last discussion is the perception that we can solve Nigerian problem or address these challenges with one strike or even one summit meeting. In reality, the challenges facing our country are deep-rooted and multidimensional, and therefore, addressing them will actually require continuous strategies, continuous thinking, continuous engagement and conversation from all stakeholders. The Buhari administration have contributed in addressing some of those root causes and identify 3 pillars of addressing them, these challenges. This include, first, securing the country, because if the country is not secure, obviously the environment for promoting businesses, growing the economy, or shared prosperity will actually not be possible. Secondly, growing the economy and diversifying it is also one of the pillars, because I think it's a United Nations study that says that by the year 2050, Nigeria may very well become the 3rd most populous country in the world, next to first India, China, and ourselves. By itself, that's not a bad thing, because any concentration of people that will be the 3rd largest in the world cannot be ignored. So we cannot be ignored. But at the same time, we have to plan, we have to grow the economy, we have to diversify the economy in ways that will make it possible for our people at that time to have the benefit of what the resources that the Almighty has bestowed on this country. I was, in this regard, a visiting professor in Singapore in 2013, and I went to their parliament, and I was listening to a discussion about the projection that Singapore will have in the next 5 years, about 500,000 people to be added to the population, and there was crisis. How will we feed them? Where would they live? We have a policy that anybody should be able to get access to public transportation within a maximum of 15 minutes. So how do we employ them? Housing, education. So, and I was really impressed with the discussion that they are really talking about how to plan for the future, how to implement plans so that it becomes a reality. So I believe that those three pillars, and the third one, of course, everybody knows, good governance, by attacking all the promoting accountability and really a responsible and responsive government. So I believe that what succeeding administration could do is to continue to regard this as building the foundation on which they can build, and addressing, as we've heard from Hajia, who spoke not long ago, representing the Secretary of the Government, Hajia Abiba Lawal, the 9 priority areas that the Buhari administration has identified now and began to implement. We have to find reasons and ways in which that cannot be swept aside, and that should be the building blocks for a greater and more prosperous country. I also have another point that I took away from this last session, which is the emphasis on leadership is very critical. You have to have leaders with vision, with commitment, and with a track record of achievement. I'm not canvassing for any particular candidate, but my president, Mr. President, said what is important for him is a free and fair election, so that we Nigerians choose from among what is available. And he has proved this. If you remember, at the state level, congratulated the winner of the Edo state election, congratulated the winner of the Anambra election, more recently congratulated the winner of the gubernatorial election in Osun, because he said, what is important is free and fair and credible election. And the votes of every Nigeria should count. And whatever it is, we must say, well, we chose who to lead us. But apart from emphasizing the process of choosing our leaders through free and fair and credible elections, to which President Buhari is committed, leadership, yes, but we must not forget that to move a country forward, to promote shared prosperity, which is a theme of this year's summit, we also need shared understanding. We have to also develop shared responsibility, and above all, shared commitment. It cannot be left for government or the president alone. It's a shared understanding that will promote or be followed by shared understanding and shared responsibility and shared commitment. Now I can go on, but I won't. I have to develop the discipline of doing as I'm told, which is to deliver a closing address. Thank you very much. So in doing so, I want to begin by saying what a pleasure to be with you on this very important occasion of the closing ceremony of the 28th Nigeria Economic Summit, which ostensibly is the 28th Nigeria Economic Summit, the last summit for the current administration under the leadership of His Excellency President Muhammad Buhari, GCFR. I'm grateful for the opportunity to deliver this closing address and be part of history It is indeed my first participation in the annual economic summit in this capacity. I've participated in some of the earlier ones, but when I was much freer and a private citizen. Therefore, I could say what I like, how I like, the way I like. But nonetheless, I believe that the engagement in the last 2 days have not only been enriching but rewarding, particularly with the words of wisdom delivered by nobody else but the revered Mr. Pascal Dozier during his keynote address at the opening ceremony. I'm confident that many of us have learned 1 or 2 lessons from the person I call the old reliable. He's always there, the Musée de Wise, and he has impacted quite a bit of his wisdom in that keynote address. I was also thrilled to learn that very frank discussions and no holds barred submissions were made by the panelists at the opening plenary. Such is the type of engagement out of which great ideas, sustainable ideas, and strategies are born. It's also reassuring to note that some state governors, past and present, honorable ministers, permanent secretaries, director generals of government agencies, and directors of federal and state MDAs, civil society organizations, development partners, as well as captains of industry participated very actively in this year's summit. No doubt the summit has been, as has been the case in the past, lived up to its billing. It is also instructive to note that participation in the annual economic summit attracts experts from very diverse backgrounds and helps in deepening as well as broadening citizens' collaboration and ownership in the formulation of sound and implementable government and national policies. This is an indication that all stakeholders are committed to work closely with government in setting priorities for a shared prosperity for the benefit of our people, because it's only through shared prosperity that we can promote sustainability of wealth and development of any country. On the inception of this administration, we understood and accepted that our partnership with the private sector was essential for the country's economic growth and development. This summit over the last 2 days has facilitated deep and meaningful conversation between public, private, and civil society leaders. Together, we have created an environment of mutual respect and dialogue. And I hope, Mr. Godalo, we also mutual trust, which cannot be done in 1 day on one summit, but has to be sustained. This understanding has informed our engagement with the summit process, which has generated many policy recommendations for government action. The 28th summit, just like previous summits, recorded huge successes, not because of the high turnout of delegates, both virtual and in person, but we have been able to do justice to the various issues discussed at both the plenary and the concurrent sessions. As you are all aware, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, to set priorities for a shared prosperity and secure the future of our citizens and country, we need to pay greater attention to concentric economic diversification and build human capital for a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economy that de-emphasizes sole dependency on a singular extractive commodity. This is more reason why our administration, the Buhari administration, is committed to implementing the energy transition plan and building infrastructure for a competitive economy. It's also important to note that when the MD of Shell was discussing the petroleum industry bill, which has since become the Petroleum Industries Act, there was very close collaboration between the government and the private sector. Similarly, in the recent Nigerian startup bill, which has now been signed into law by Mr. President, at every stage of that process, the private sector has been very closely involved. That is the model that we hope that will be sustained in successive administrations. I'm confident that the report of this year's summit will articulate the key issues exhaustively discussed in the various sessions, especially the section covering high-level forum on multidimensional poverty, future of fiscal policy, unlocking the binding constraints to execution, financing Nigerian human capital development, envisioning Nigeria's future workforce, and implementing the Nigerian project, among others. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that the task of setting and implementing priority for shared prosperity requires the support of all Nigerians. This cannot be overemphasized. I therefore urge the leadership of the states, the local governments, private sector, civil society organizations, and development partners to join hands with the federal government to actualize the future we envisage and the Nigeria we need for our people. And we have to make it happen. In this regard, let me share with this distinguished audience an anecdote. In January 1984, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Prof. visited the new administration under the then General Muhammad Buhari, head of the military government. And our president asked him, head of state asked him, this Secretary General, very experienced man in world affairs, we are just 1 week old in office. I happen to be sitting in on that meeting. What advice can you give us in terms of going forward and realizing the hopes and aspirations of Nigerians? And the Secretary General then asked him, do you want a diplomatic or an honest answer? And I didn't think there was a distinction between the two, but I think some nuances. And he said, of course, a very honest answer. I said, well, please don't take negatively what I'm about to say. Perez de Cuellar said, he said, I'm from a third world country, Peru. But people used to say of Peru, that Peru is a potentially rich and powerful country. But they have been saying that for the last 200 years. Do not let it be said of Nigeria, your country, that Nigeria is a potentially rich and powerful, stable, united country. And let them not say, continue to say for the next 100, 200 years. The potentials of your country needs to be translated into reality, into what your people can benefit and so whatever you can do to translate that potential into reality, please do not hesitate. We didn't know, of course, that we only have 20 months in office at that time. But now, as fate will have it, the same General Buhari back as now concluding his second term in office as a democratically elected president. But clearly, that lesson that there's no time to waste, we have to translate those potential into the benefit and shared prosperity of our people. But he knows he cannot do it alone. He has to do it in conjunction with all the stakeholders, and he has to rely on the cooperation and support, both from within and without, including, as one of the participants said here, capital, the investment. A lot of trillions of dollars are out there willing to come for investment and looking for investment. Of course, international capital is also a coward. They don't invest where there's any threat of to their investment. But we're creating a good environment of peace, of continuity of policy. I think we can attract investment such that, as was also said in another conference that I attended not long ago, when some investors, I think African Americans, who I believe in Ghana, yes, there was in Ghana, and they were trying to discuss what would be the environment to promote investments in Africa. And of course, the Ghanaian speaker, participant said, well, Ghana is your gateway to Africa, and that is where investors should come. And trust my countrymen, one of them raised his hand and said, yes, Ghana may be the gateway, but Nigeria is the destination. And it is the destination, not so much the journey, that you should be interested in, but we must again translate this into reality and for attraction of direct private investment. And I'm glad the Executive Secretary of the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission is here and has an important role to play in this leading in this regard. Well, meanwhile, let me assure all participants here that government will continue to collaborate with the Nigerian Economic Summit Group in organizing future summits. While we await the recommendations as will be contained in the Green Book, I assure all participants, including members of the private sector, the business community, that we shall align your recommendations with government priorities for implementation. At this juncture, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Mr. Pascal Dossier once again and all the founding members of the Nigerian Economic Summit for the legacy which they have bequeathed to this nation. History will certainly be very kind to them all. Can we give them a round of applause? It is the hope that all of us from now henceforth shall be able to reflect this legacy, we transmit this legacy from what we have bequeathed to us. Once again, I congratulate all of you for being part of this summit and for your very useful contribution. On this note, it's now my singular honor and privilege to declare the 28th Nigerian Economic Summit closed. I thank you for your attention and wish you journey message to return home. God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. The Chief of Staff to His Excellency the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, we appreciate you. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's been 2 days of amazing work. And there are some people that have been working behind the scene, the rapporteurs, the Central Working Committee, have been putting a lot of things together from behind the scene. And so for the summit summary, let me welcome here the chair of the NES 28 Central Organizing Committee, the very cerebral Chinenye Mba Uzuku. Well, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, you might need to leave that. Let me welcome Mr. Chinenye Mba Uzuku here to say a few things before we move on. Mr. Chinenye, please.
The Chief of Staff, Honorable Ministers here present, the Chairman of Nigerian Economic Summit Group, members of the Joint Planning Committee, members of the COC, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us for the past 2 days. I think there's a vote of thanks coming up, but our goal was actually to present to you a summary of the summit. However, we had slight challenges with our time and slight challenges with our technology towards the end. So the Chief of Staff had to leave for an engagement, direct engagement with the President. So we couldn't, we had to make some quick adjustments. Of course, we cannot be speaking after the closing of the summit itself. So my apologies to everyone for that. I think what we will do is we'll make sure that the slides are made available to everyone. And we will also, of course, you'll get the Green Book, which this year we've committed to producing the Green Book, not just in English, but we're also going to produce the Green Book in local languages to ensure that the story of what happens at the Economic Summit gets to the grassroots. I want to put on record usually when we come to this day at the end of summit, it's exhausting for a lot of people, but the planning for summit actually begins. In fact, planning for summit 2023 probably begins tomorrow. Everyone who's been involved is simply going to go back and think again. We're going to do a cleanup. We're going to start all over again to be sure that we can bring you the same summit for the 31st time. I mean, for the 29th time, 29th edition of the summit in 2023. It's important that I put on record as well the incredible support that we've received, particularly from the board of NESG. When we were called as volunteers into the COC, we were told that the members of NESG, people who work in NESG, are people who pay to serve. It's important, and I thought it was really important to share with you what that really means. If you haven't experienced this as an individual or a professional, you really need to understand what that means. It's a huge country, but as many of us would know, we are not that many who actually put our hands on the plow and get things moving. In fact, in one of the studies that we've seen so far, one of the books that we've read so far, the book that was quoted at the beginning of the summit, they mentioned the book written by the legendary Chinua Achebe, which he titled The Trouble with Nigeria. One of the lines inside that book speaks about how Nigerians, once they gather together, they talk a lot about their problems, and it sometimes can be a problem in itself. They're talking about the problems. Fortunately for us, the structure of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group and the summit itself goes beyond just talking. Many times we're asked the question, after all the talk, what happens? And I think in some ways, I have been one of those who have been advocating consistently to the board and to the management that we need to speak more about what we're able to achieve, both from the NESG's perspective, as well as from the partnership with the federal government of Nigeria. It has been something that I would say is an incredible experience when you just let go of literally everything you're doing and you spend almost an entire year working through what we have done in the past, I would say 48 hours. In terms of a summary, and I ask your permission to quickly take you through about 15 slides that capture the incredible amount of work that was done here today, not just by the people who organized it, but also by you as participants. We are convinced that it would be unfair for us not to adequately capture and represent and reflect to you exactly what it is that you told us and you told all Nigerians today. So I crave your indulgence and see how quickly we can go through this so that we can move on to our next program. The summit itself was themed, as you know, 2023 and beyond, priorities for shared prosperity. Those who were not at the opening session may not have understood exactly why we chose this theme. The board cascaded this theme to us as part of a long view that they've taken of Nigeria over the past 27 summits. There was a clear sense that we were in a transition year. and perhaps one of the most important and the most critical transition years of our time. Because as our father, mentor, and leader, Dr. Pascal Dozier told us, we have been here before. When we were here before, a few people saw the challenge, and rather than buckle, they asked themselves, what can we do about it? The great story is that we're here today because those people decided to do something about it. So through 5 plenaries, 10 interactive panels, 4 industry meetings, 2 design workshops, and 1 roundtable, we have gone through, within 48 hours, literally the entire gamut of Nigeria's challenges. And we've asked ourselves what we can do about it. Collectively, I will share with you what we've agreed. The first and the most important point that was made was coming from the keynote itself, where we're told that we should not be afraid. We should understand that we've met this crisis before and that we have overcome it, and that we will do so again. And the way to do so that we are not in that house that we were all watching the video, singing songs of lamentation, is if we work together across public and private sector in a collaborative manner to confront those challenges and to come up with active solutions, but to go beyond that to actually implement them. The opening plenary panel had a really robust discussion, out of which we selected 6 points. Many of you, a few of us like myself, had notes that were covered like 2 pages. Very frank, very open conversations. But what are the 6 things that came out of that panel? The first is fuel subsidy removal. A lot has been said about it. And I think we don't need to say more, other than there's an urgent need to remove the fuel subsidy. They also spoke about tax compliance and Nigeria's situation regarding tax and the ability of Nigeria to actually garner more revenue from tax, provided that the trust deficit that exists between the citizen and the government and the infrastructure and the institutions that are needed to gather that tax and to convince the citizens to participate and pay tax as part of their contribution as citizens of the country is met. There was also a strong discussion about education, and it was said that education, public sector education, needs to be brought back, needs to be restored, and this is across all tiers, to ensure that through education, we enable the kind of citizens to be the best that they can be, and by extension, they grow our country. They spoke about a diaspora resource mobilization, recognizing that a large part of Nigeria's talent is actually leaving, and the fact that we feel this impact in our country implies that we are perhaps losing those who have the greatest contribution to make towards accelerating the economy. And we should turn that into a resource for ourselves. A very strong point was made about the need to get politics right. Some statements were made, and I think I can't quote it exactly, but I think we have it up there, that we need to get the politics right. I think there was a stronger statement that was made, which is that politics trumps economics. And so no matter how many theories and models we come up with, if the politics is wrong, we're never going to get it right. So we need to fix the politics and get that right. We spoke about the need for reforms, particularly in the civil service, land and agriculture, 3 elements and three components that were the panel put forward as being critical for us to get acceleration, as binding constraints to our ability to move things forward. When we take everything that happened over these sessions, we put them back into the 4 pillars that we started with, that we believe are elements of what enables us to achieve this goal of shared priorities, priorities for shared prosperity. And I'll just quickly go through them. First of all, we recognize the need for macroeconomic stability, and in the pillar under delivering macroeconomic stability for growth, we spoke about the monetary and the fiscal challenges that Nigeria actually has. And there was a clear statement that there needs to be, apart from this policy around the fuel subsidy removal, we needed to get a better grip of our exchange management policies. And we needed to reduce the rate of our borrowing and focus on revenue enhancement. And this was the best way for us to get some kind of environment in which business could actually grow. The second thing we spoke about was about security, and we had a solution for security. We said, as the chairman has mentioned, and most others have said, without security, there's no question of economic growth. And therefore, we needed to figure out what should be done about security. And the one theme that came strongly through was a requirement first of a subnational police force, not only to address the current challenges that we have, but to create an atmosphere of continuous safety and security that allows investments to come in, but most importantly, allows the everyday person on the streets to feel that they are in a country that cares for them and for which their own safety and security is paramount. We spoke about infrastructure development, which is a long story for Nigeria, but we did hammer that investment in infrastructure needs to be investment that is tied to a productive Nigeria. And some comment has been made about, some comments were also made in that session around how there are things to do, there's a lot to do, a lot of legacy, but prioritizing what we actually invest in must be linked directly to how it influences our productive capacity. We spoke strongly about MSMEs and the realization that Nigeria has a lot of businesses, 43 million. And in one of the sessions, somebody said we are 200 million Nigerians and we must have 200 million MSMEs. And it caused laughter in the hall, essentially saying that every single Nigerian is an entrepreneur and everybody is working to bring themselves out of poverty. We're not a society where people sit and wait for things to happen for them. Therefore, the focus on the ease of doing business is critical because once we can address that, we unlock the capacity of our people. And we support through these MSMEs, they drive employment and they drive productivity. We spoke about reforming the regulatory framework, reforming regulatory frameworks because we knew that there was an excessive and in some cases overlapping regulation that was holding businesses down, and we needed to have a way to sort that out. I think some comments were also made in the last session around that as well. For capacity optimization, there was a realization as well that we need to position every single state in Nigeria to achieve its full potential. The sense that we live in a country where there's an overemphasis on what is happening at a federal level, in some ways detracts from the focus of the subnationals to actually achieve their own full potential. Literally, every state has something to offer. And in the community of states that we have as a federation, if we're able to establish comparative advantages, prioritize investments and investments and our energies, our human resources around those comparative advantages, we could get progress. And therefore, we said that every state must be empowered to determine their primary energy source. And by this, we mean ability to operate off of the national grid if necessary, and if this is best for that particular state. So because we identified power, energy as the most critical element to industrialization and business growth. We also spoke about manufacturing, but beyond all this, there was a clear statement coming through. It's only an educated people that can be productive within the system. And there was an understanding as well that we need to drive these minimum standards. We have to establish minimum standards that are not just relevant to the 21st century, but are relevant to producing individuals who can, of their own, be productive within the society. We also felt that if we did so, we would drive the scalability of SMEs, where over 90% of businesses in Nigeria exist. And lastly, under macroeconomic stability, we focus on the export capacity. There is a clear understanding around the reality that we must in some way increase our export earnings. And the export potentials of Nigeria should not be locked into this constant discussion around, are we a monocultural, a monoproduct economy? But we need to find some way to create export capacity, even as we already see export capacity growing in areas like the digital economy. We don't even know, in truth, the real amount of income that is being earned by Nigerians through remote working, for example, over the internet. So there's a lot of discussions around that, but every state needs to then ask itself, what is it that I am best positioned to export? And how do we drive that aggressively? Investing in our future was that pillar that was referencing really human capital, the quality, the quantity of human capital. And the conclusions that came from there was that we actually lack the data that we require to plan. Without the data around our human capital, it's almost impossible to make a plan going forward. And so policy needs to be informed by data, and we need to enhance our capacity to actually take that data. In one or two of the sessions, there were questions around whether the numbers we had were right or wrong. I think we need to take that, well, not I think, the panel was saying, take that off the table. We need accuracy around the critical numbers, the critical components to drive this piece around our human capital. For diaspora engagement, As I said earlier, there was some discussion as well around the diaspora. We talked extensively around this. We talked about the issue of the Japa syndrome that seems to be hitting Nigeria. We also spoke about the sheer number of people who are leaving the country, and realized that we're even though it's a small number, when you see the impact on the economy, you can then realize that these people, if we can find some way to connect consistently to the diaspora and cycle back not just their resources, but their network and their capability, that we could actually be doing more than just taking remittances. We could actually be connecting a new engine of growth to the economy. And therefore, we had some discussion as well around diaspora funding. In terms of food security, which is threatening the country and threatening the citizens of this country, and food inflation, there was also a very deep discussion around boosting agricultural productivity, understanding that about 82% of our farmers are smallholder farmers, and that those are largely around, and that 82%, when you overlap that with the number of people who are classified as poor in the country, you start to see there's a nexus between smallholder farming and poverty. So boosting agricultural productivity fundamentally impacts the least and the most vulnerable persons in our society, and takes them away from that position of fragility. And emphasis was brought on the grain production. And this was the one area that the group on agriculture said we need to figure out how to escalate that. We've spoken about education, and as you can see, it's a recurring theme through almost everything that was said. Driving investments into education is critical because of funding. And we looked at how do we develop initiatives, and we said we have to figure out the financing of education. In some ways, education is maybe too important to be left to a single entity. It is not the task of a subnational or the task of the federal government alone. It's a task for every single one of us. But the question that faces us is that we have a deficit of decades that needs to be fixed in infrastructure, in access, number of teachers, the educational resources within the school, etc. How do we fix this? But most importantly, how do we expand access while maintaining some level of equity within the education system? And this panel, the feedback that came from this was that we need to look aggressively at unlocking the potential of education bonds. People should be able to, if we aspire for an educated citizenry, our children must be able to go to school regardless of the economic status of their parents. And the best way to do that was to look towards educational bonds. Around innovation, we spoke about the unicorns and all the great things that have happened in the tech space, particularly around the financial technology space. And we've asked ourselves, how can we not just have unicorns, but how do we create innovation as a national capability? The key question was, innovation doesn't grow in specific places because somebody watered that grass, but rather innovation is a latent capability across the entire country. And therefore, policy must go towards creating those hubs where innovation itself can actually surface. And so we wanted to link that directly to some of the critical concerns around climate change, and we talked about carbon markets as well. And we're saying that even as we're building the economy, we should build economy with conscious of a circular economy paradigm that says that we must be efficient and sustainable in the way that we use our resources, and we must be innovative in the way that we look at solving those problems. For digital transformation, we talked about funding the digital economy. I think there's some understanding that increasingly the growth we see in the digital economy may be coming from foreign direct investment, but we need to figure out how internally we can also start to power that. And one of the critical ways that was put forward was the work that Nigeria will do at the national and the subnational levels with the multilateral institutions and even with the government itself to unlock perhaps dormant funding that could go to stimulate the digital economy and the transformation that must happen in that sector. Export capacity, we've spoken about that. There was some discussion from a technology perspective around the kind of environments that we have a digital first generation today that is living in a world that was almost inconceivable 15 years ago before the GSM revolution. And as a consequence, all our planning and all the investments in terms of enabling infrastructure must go towards unlocking the capacity of that digital first generation. And so there was talk about state-owned enterprises in the ICT industry, linkages between private sector involvement, private sector initiatives, and the government itself as a buyer of technology. We also spoke about, specifically, there was a session on aviation, and we said we needed to look critically at the Nigeria Civil Aviation Master Plan. On financial inclusion, we continue to leave too many people behind. We realize that the startup ecosystem is itself hampered by access to capital and funding at that level, and that there's a need for us to figure out how do we, even as we drive financial inclusion, it should not be inclusion for the poor. It should be inclusion from the perspective of enablement and empowerment, so that these people are no longer poor. A strong emphasis was put on ethical management, around privacy laws and regulations, agri optimization, and healthcare. A healthy nation, of course, is, as the ADH goes, is a wealthy nation. And so there was some talk about prioritizing healthcare and making it possible for primary healthcare to actually become realistic which is where the bulk of our population will actually access health sector benefits. There was a key suggestion around introducing a health tax to drive sectoral growth. And then there was also an issue around implementing robust accountability about utilization of funds in this sector. Unbinding the critical constraints execution was about answering the question. We have never been short of plans. We've also never been short of people. What has prevented Nigeria from getting to this place that it has planned to go to all these years? And there was a thinking that we needed to remove those things that are constraints to execution. A lot of conversation, very robust and very powerful conversation was made about this. And the first part and the first commitment was that we're saying that everybody needs to have buy-in and commitment. It's not enough to talk about it in a finger-pointing kind of way, but we needed to figure out how does everybody engage in that process itself so that we can become part of the solution and not just finger pointers at the question. And to do that, there was a lot of discussion around having a truly shared vision. Questions were raised as to whether we all agree as to where we're going to, and as a consequence, if we don't agree, can we actually travel along the same route? Linking that was a question of technology and performance management. We felt very strongly that when you want to hold anyone accountable, you must also have the metrics for doing so. And so it was critical for us to develop a performance management and implement performance management within the system, not just to let people know better what is expected of them, but also to be able to give feedback and to guide, and in some cases to provide accountability around execution. So a merit-based civil service, I think, is the real outcome of all this. That the question of tenure in civil service may not be questioned, but there may be a question around whether tenure does mean that you should have low productivity or non-productivity at all. And so merit as an underlying anchor for the civil service system in Nigeria came key. There was a lot of conversation as well about diversity and the realization that we continue as a nation to talk about it, but not necessarily do the needful. The reality is that we continue to exclude a large part of our population from being part of the production. And tomorrow's summit on gender is going to focus on one of the most important elements of that picture. What is the role that gender plays in enabling an economy power through, and what is the role when it becomes a constraint to us achieving our goal? And so a strong focus on youth and women being included on the basis of competency, really, and without bias. There was also a question around implementation. So for implementation, we said the delivery function is key. And I think many people have asked that question. When you come up with the plans, why is it not delivered? And the last panel was, the last plenary was actually quite robust in terms of discussing that after talk, what then happens? And so the delivery function has become critical. When you tie this, we tie this back to the performance management system and the accountabilities that are driven there, which is that we make a promise in whatever roles that we have to deliver something, we should be held accountable for it. There was some discussion as well as continuity in terms of government planning, whether or not as we go from one administration to the next, they're able to carry through and not have to restart things that had been done previously. We've spoken about the minimum standards, I won't go in there. The last pillar is around transformational leadership. And as the Honorable Minister, to borrow his term, this is where the rubber hits the road. Essentially, the concern that has come forth and was discussed and dealt with here is that there is a need to help evolve an electoral process that allows the electorate to identify transformational leaders, to recognize them when they see them, to know that at the local government, at the state, and at the federal levels, anyone who aspires to office or who aspires to a leadership position, we should be able to identify those people. But beyond identifying them, they need to be helped through the process, because the feedback came that the system we currently have tends to filter people out of the process. And at the end of the day, you don't have absolutely your best and your most transformational in positions of authority. And that when they do get in there, we need to be able to support them, to monitor them, to track their performance, and to give them clear feedback as to what it is that they're doing. I say this with great respect, and this is my side comment, for all the people who step up to leadership. That leadership is extremely lonely. And I'm sure that there are times when those who have stepped forward to lead in different areas have looked around and they felt, I wish there was somebody who could just give me a pat on the back or just help me through to the next day. And so with great empathy for leadership, I think is something that we should also look at. The panel that looked at the Electoral Act was clear that we have made great improvement in that process, but still somewhere along the line, we are starting to see that at some point, performance, transformational leadership falls aside for expediency in the political process. And so we feel that there must be some way in which we continue to drive that process of change in the Electoral Act to codify criteria and qualifications for leadership and for succession. We also spoke about youth participation and gender parity in Nigerian politics. And we spoke extensively about intentionally building institutions that grow leaders. Because leadership is not something that you may think you're born with it, but the best leaders in the countries that have been able to evolve the strongest succession of leaders have done so because they've institutionalized the process of creating leaders. And so we've spoken about capacity building and mentorship platforms and the proliferation of such. We need actually to go to school to be able to be in governance. We can't assume that people come from wherever they are and suddenly become leaders. As one of our pre-summit panels, they said you take off your agbada or rather you pull on your agbada and you go into office and you're supposed to perform. It's not done that way. You have to get people who are passed through a structured process. And so leadership capacity building and mentorship, in the same way we do it in the private sector, we would like to see more of that happening in the public sector. It would also enable the transfer of knowledge and the transition through every election cycle. We spoke about it, heightening involvement of civil society organization. But all this boils down to one thing, and that came out of our keynotes and has been shared repeatedly through all the sessions, that unless we develop, drive, and inspire a shared vision, and accept that we all have a shared responsibility, it may be difficult, if not impossible, to access our full potential as a nation. In doing so, we have to accept some level of vulnerability. Every leader and everyone who is involved in the process, and this includes the citizen themselves, they need to be they need to be vulnerable. And by vulnerable here, we were referring to an end-to-end transparency in everything that you do. The extent to which you are transparent is the extent to which you're vulnerable. And once we implement structures and processes that ensure accountability within our polity and within our economy, we will start to see that we become more attractive as an investment destination. We'll also begin to see that individuals can actually achieve their full potential and contribute fully to this nation and to the economy that is there. We've said that there's a little bit of weakness in terms of how we communicate projects that are ongoing within the system. We've spoken about communication around government's goals, and I think the last panel also spoke about things like the challenge we face in terms of deficit of trust may sometimes be because we're not communicating properly in terms of the things that we want to do and why we want to do them. We've also spoke about the cost of governance optimization. The summit was of the opinion that we must assess and optimize the cost of governance. And this is not just in the field of governance as in administration. We are challenged in basic things like understanding what is the cost of educating a single child to the level of basic education, to secondary and to tertiary. And we know that we are in some way subsidizing that cost, but do we even know the value of that subsidy? And so when we train and they leave, what is the country itself losing? When they come back as better educated, what is it that we're gaining? So there's this critical role that government has to play here in terms of figuring out an assessment framework for building proper ways of discovering the real cost of governments, because you can only optimize what you already know. If you don't know it, there's nothing to optimize. And lastly, there was on this one angle, there's a continuous review of government spending to drive efficiency and effectiveness. I think this is quite clear. It's even more so because we're operating in a volatile and an atmosphere of volatility and uncertainty. Post-COVID and the recessions, the country's faced, as with every other economy, is faced with challenges of how to manage public finance. And how do you do that while at the same time keeping the country going? It will not happen with one budget and one statement in a year. So perhaps there may need to be a method of having continuous reviews, as we also have in the private sector. You set your budget at the beginning of the year, but you have quarterly reviews and you keep making those changes to meet with the exigencies that you see in the environment and the opportunities that are up there. We spoke about driving deeper synergy across government and between governments to be sure that we have one government, a whole of government approach to most things will enable us to remove the inefficiencies and create a lot of momentum so that we are not doing the things that one agency has done, another agency is also trying to do. And removing those overlaps not just optimizes the function that you're trying to perform, but it also enables us to achieve that in a faster way. And so there needs to be a framework to allow this happen, more and more collaboration within and across government. And of course, the removal of regulation. The last point is kept last for a purpose, and that's because it's up to you and I. We feel, the summit feels, that it's absolutely important that citizenship should be taken for what it really is. It's not just a benefit of being a citizen of a country, it's a responsibility to be a citizen of a country. And that responsibility calls upon you to step forward and to take ownership of things that are happening within your society and within your economy. And so even though we may call continuously for governance and for improvement in governance, we also need to look at ourselves and to say to ourselves that the people must know that acting right would help guarantee a future for themselves and their children. It's really up to us. And on that note, I want to say on behalf of everyone who has been part of this summit, we are believing that it is indeed possible for a nation to be born in one day. And that day is the day when we have the change in our hearts and in our minds and decide that this country is ours and it will be what we decide for it, we want it to be. Thank you.
I didn't feel like talking again. I'm absolutely speechless, smooth, silky, beautiful. And then if we are talking about shared prosperity, he's one of the prosperity we need to share. The committee that put this report together, are they in the room? Please rise, please rise. Let's appreciate them. Let's appreciate them.
Please just, sorry, I just want to recognize the role that EY provided us. And these gentlemen, these ladies and these gentlemen who are from here did incredible work in the background, putting things together. We're really grateful to them. And I wanted to just quickly say that it epitomizes, it really, please, if you don't mind, please come up. Along with the technical team, technical subcommittee, and all the members of the secretariats, I really cannot tell you, and the JPC, I really cannot tell you how truly incredible. Yeah, so Ernst & Young is EY, they're a consulting firm. Please come forward, let them see you because you did the work. I really don't know, there's so many people here The JPC, thank you, sir, for coming. The way that summit is organized is a partnership between NESG and the federal government of Nigeria, led by the Federal Ministry of Finance. And what we do is that we set up a joint planning committee, which is people from both sides, private sector and public sector, coming together to start the process, to think through what needs to be done, and then to run it all the way through. So they own complete ownership. Within the JPC itself, then we formed the Central Organizing Committee, which is the team that I was privileged to lead. It's difficult when you say that you're the chairman of something, but you know that you're really just, you're really not, you're not even the chair. You're just like one of the stools, one of the legs on the stool. It would have been absolutely impossible to have gotten us to where we are today without these people. And I don't know, please, my gratitude to them and to those who are not here and to those who are up there that we don't see, and those who are online across Nigeria and across the world. It's absolutely important to me that we convey what it means, that it is a privilege indeed to pay to serve. These people don't earn salaries. They are volunteers who have left what it is that they do to stand up for Nigeria. So thank you very much. Thank you.
They are not paid. And so without much ado, let me invite the Permanent Secretary, Budget and National Planning, Engineer Nebeolisa, Anako, to do the vote of thanks.
Your Excellencies, the Chief of Staff to Mr. President, Honorable Ministers, very distinguished participants, I plead to stand on existing protocol. My task is easy, just to give the vote of thanks, and the last speaker has very well rounded up the takeaways from this conference. It's always very important to end up with a good summary. I remember when I was in school, Economics 101, there's always a proviso, all things being equal, ceteris paribus. And the Chief of Staff, Mr. President, when he was speaking to us earlier, also alluded to that, says a work in progress. Ronald Reagan used to tell a joke when he was the president of the US, and often sometimes surrounded by economists and receiving different economic advice. He will often, he'll go into a story of the oldest profession, the argument about which one is the oldest profession. And it starts with the engineer, who we boast during the Roman era, we built bridges. Then the lawyer will come in and say, no, even at creation, that God restored order. God started by separating the waters and so on, and establishing order out of chaos. By this time, the economist is already overwhelmed with laughter. So everybody, when we finish laughing, they will now ask him, why are you laughing? Are you an old profession? His response was, who created the chaos? So economic chaos. I will now say that, however, the situation here, that shows the importance of this NESG. For almost 30 years now, since 1992-93, NESG has become a shining light on what can be achieved in public-private sector collaboration, where business leaders, development partners jointly brainstorm with top government officials to examine issues in the economy and fashion a way forward. So on behalf of the Federal Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning, and the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, let me first give glory to God for making this 28th Economic Summit a resounding success, even with rescheduling of this event as a result of other some national assignments. I'm particularly grateful to His Excellency, President Mohammed Buhari, DCFR, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Federal Republic of Nigeria, for graciously delivering the opening address and declaring the summit open as represented by the VP. This singular honor is a testament to the commitment of the federal government to the success of this summit, and we are very grateful. We're also most grateful to His Excellency, the Vice President, Professor Yemi Osibanjo, GCON. Has always been a source of inspiration and has guided us through this summit, through the summit preparation process, and also given us the honor of his invaluable presence. And the continued support to the ministry and the summit is deeply appreciated. My thanks goes to the Chief of Staff, to Mr. President, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, for his attendance at this closing plenary and the very useful closing remarks he gave. And of course, the promise of continued government support that he gave us here. The assurance is very good. We thank him for that. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, permit me to extend our sincere appreciation to the leadership of members of the National Assembly, the state governors, for participating actively through this two-day event. Their commitment to this summit demonstrates the determination of the various tiers of government to work with the private sector to realize the country's development aspirations. We are very grateful to the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Mr. Bose Mustafa, CFR, who was ably represented by Dr. Habiba Lawal, my senior retired colleague, who is now a senior special assistant to Mr. President. We're also very grateful to the honorable ministers, the head of service, my colleague permanent secretaries, and other senior government officials, both at the federal and state levels, for their active participation in the summit. We thank the PAMSECs that attended in person, including Dr. Magdalene Ajani, the PAMSEC Transportation, Engineer Funsho Adebi, the PAMSEC Minister of Niger Data Affairs, Dr. Oluwatoyin Akinlade, the PAMSEC Federal Ministry of Mines and State Development, and other PAMSECs that attended. We are all appreciated. Worthy of mention is our private sector partners who have worked around the clock to ensure the success of this summit. We appreciate you all. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, permit me to use this opportunity to express our heartfelt appreciation to the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Dr. Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, CON, and the Honorable Minister of State, Budget and National Planning, Prince Clem Abba, for their support, providing direction, as well as superintending over the preparations of this summit. I thank you for your leadership. Mr. Pascal Dozier, the pioneer chairman of NESG, set the tone earlier at day one for the summit when he reached into his deep reservoir of wisdom to deliver his seminar keynote address on the Nigeria we need. The Nigeria we need, very important. His address is remarkably similar to that delivered by the immediate past president of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, at the presidential retreat of our president with the ministers, foreign secretaries, and other top government officials at the presidential villa on Monday, October 17th of this year. And he said, because he told us how he went through a very difficult transition in his country, Kenya, but he was able to overcome through statesmanly actions. And he came out with the saying that there's no development without peace. And there's no peace without inclusive governance. He was giving his experience, like I said, which led him to engage with all Kenyans, both in government and in opposition, in the lead up to the election, including the opposition. And that enabled him to have very successful and peaceful elections in Kenya. So that all goes to the theme of this conference, priorities for shared prosperity. I think the key word there is shared prosperity. So, and we are told again by the pioneer chairman yesterday that to overcome nation building frustrations, what is needed is inclusive growth, inclusive governance, and shared prosperity. We cannot thank you enough, pioneer chairman, for that address. Let me also thank the chairman of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Mr. Swo Iyadolo, for all his efforts. Aswo Iyadolo. Did I pronounce it with an Igbo name? My apologies. Iyadolo for his efforts. Well, I think there is some element of printer's devil too, but my apologies again. The chairman and his ESG has shown a outstanding commitment and maturity in ensuring the success of this summit. Just like you have done through your 2 tenures spanning 4 years as the chairman of the NESG. Well, thank you sincerely. You have extended your purposeful leadership of the Nigerian Economic Summit to the partnership between your organization and government, and this no doubt contributed to the success we are witnessing here today. The CEO NESG, Mr. Loyo Jayola, also deserves our thanks for his leadership and commitment in coordination with this event. The chairman and CEO provided the needed inspiration to the members of the Joint Planning Committee for the next 28. And other key officials throughout the planning for the summit. I say thank you. I would also like to appreciate in a special way institutions, sponsors, corporate organizations, and individuals that contributed towards the hosting of this summit. In particular, we would like to recognize our sponsors, including Stanbic Bank, Stanbic IBTC, MTN Nigeria, Promise of Nigeria PLC, Sterling Bank, I Invest, Total Energies, Shell Petroleum, Nigeria LNG Limited, King Care, Nesto, Airtel, Banwo, and Iyadolo, New Globe. I think after this summit, I will take a course. I will approach the secretariat for a course on that pronunciation. I have to get it right. The New Globe, Dana, among others. We appreciate and cherish your generous contributions. Furthermore, I thank our esteemed foreign guests, resource persons, virtual participants, chairmen, chairpersons of different sessions, moderators, and panelists. You brought your wealth of experience and contributed immensely to the success of this summit. So from the depth of my heart, I say thank you. And special thanks must also go to the co-chairs of public sector and the private sector. Mr. Felix Okonkwo, head of the Economic Growth Department of the ministry, who is the co-chair public sector, and Mrs. Ijeoma Taylor, head co-chair of the private sector. I want to also especially thank all the members of the Joint Planning Committee, other officials that have worked tirelessly to make this summit a resounding success. I will not end this vote of thanks without appreciating our friends in the media for always being very supportive. I salute your objective reportage and the publicity you have given to this summit. The compares MCs for this summit, you made the event look so easy due to your expertise, and we appreciate that. My sincere gratitude goes to the rapporteurs whom we entrusted with the responsibility of capturing the details of all that transpired in this summit. You are indeed wonderful. Finally, I will not fail to thank all our most valued participants for attending this summit. It has been 2 days of brainstorming, even though tomorrow, I want to remind us all, we have the Gender Day, Gender Summit. But I trust that we are all going back better informed now, and more determined in our resolve to make our country prosperous and deliver priorities for a shared prosperity beyond 2023. I thank you all and wish you journey mercies.
Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I was following him with rapt attention when he was mentioning all the people to be thanked, and he missed one person. And I was surprised the person called me to complain. He missed himself by not thanking himself. Let's put our hands together for him, ladies and gentlemen. So like I said, let me inform you again, tomorrow, the Gender Summit will hold here. Among some of the resource persons is the British High Commissioner to Nigeria, the US Ambassador to Nigeria, and many more other people. If you are thinking of shared prosperity, then our women and the youths must be in the forefront. But it's been amazing being part of this in the last 2 days. They usually say that those who understand prosperity are those who plant trees under whose shade they're not ready to stay. What you're doing really is you're preparing for the future generation. I'd like to thank all of you for being part of this. It's been amazing being here. On behalf of my colleague, Oladele Ogulano, the handsome man with white beards, I'd like to thank all of you. Shall we all rise now for the national anthem? Please don't forget we have lunch upstairs. Have a wonderful lunch. Have a wonderful evening. God bless you.